Good evening, Molweni, Kuyanant, to all our esteemed guests, to our colleagues, friends, and distinguished members of our academic and diplomatic community that are joining us this evening. Thank you very much, Prof Pumla, for that introduction, and thanks. I think you kind of captured the fact that I've spent a fair bit of time in leadership at universities and in higher education. And, you know, this kind of opportunity to engage at a level where we start to talk around Africa and the role that we start to play in Africa excites me. But I want to also use this opportunity to share that you are making a profound contribution to not just our institution, but to the African continent by the work that you are doing in AVREC on the scholarship of memory, healing, and justice. And I think every opportunity we get at Stellenbosch University to celebrate Prof Pumla, we do so. I think if you do not know about it, she was the 2024 Templeton Prize winner. And for those of you that don't know what the Templeton Prize is it's equivalent, I would actually say it is superior to the Nobel Prize. So that's the caliber. That's the caliber of person that we are proud to have at Stellenbosch University, and for the immense amount of work that she does in a very important area at our institution, but also for the continent and for the world. Prof Pumla, your leadership and presence this evening and in terms of all the work that you do is deeply appreciated by Stellenbosch University, but I'm sure as well by the entire African community. It is my great privilege and honor to be with you this evening for the 7th Stellenbosch University Annual Africa Day Lecture, a platform that since its inception in 2018 has served as a vital space for critical dialogue, intellectual freedom, and importantly, continental imagination. Over the past 6 years, this lecture has brought together some of the most courageous and insightful voices, from writers and scholars to jurists and activists, and they have reflected on the role of the university in an ever-shifting, often fractured world. This year, as we gather under a new leadership chapter, we continue this important tradition with humility, but also with renewed purpose in terms of the role that we play on the African continent. To our keynote speaker, Professor Joel Modiri, thank you very much for joining us. Your work challenges us to reckon not only with the law, but with the deeper moral and political landscapes that shape it. We are honored that you've accepted to be our guest speaker tonight. Africa Day, as we know, marks the founding of the Organization of African Unity, a milestone that continues to symbolize solidarity and the dream of an African Renaissance. But this day is not merely about commemoration, it is really also a call to action, a reminder that our role as universities is not to observe history or simply to observe history, but also to shape it. Now, this is my first Africa Day lecture as Rector and Vice Chancellor, as Prof Pumla has indicated, and it gives me a moment on which to pause and to reflect. Over the last few months, I've had a number of opportunities to share with the community about this vision that we have for Stellenbosch University. And you would have seen in many media outputs about this emphasis on not just being a university that is on the continent, but a university that is for the continent. So as I've shared recently, Africa's time is now. It's not some distant hope, but a pressing call to action. And our universities must be bold enough to lead that charge for the African continent. At Stellenbosch University, our vision is to not just be a university in Africa, but one that is proudly and purposely for Africa. That means moving beyond all paradigms of prestige and towards a future where excellence is measured by impact, inclusion, and innovation. It means producing research that matters to rural communities, to informal economies, to climate-vulnerable regions, to young people carving out a future in a rapidly changing world. It also means confronting our own institutional past with honesty. The road to transformation is not paved with declarations, but with daily actions and decisions about who teaches, who leads, who feels that they belong. These are all the kind of issues that we've got to deal with as an institution in terms of our journey of transformation. Our transformation journey must be grounded in empathy, equity, and an unwavering belief in the brilliance of African minds. But we cannot do it alone. I believe in collaboration, not in competition. We must deepen our ties across institutions, across disciplines, and across nations through joint degrees, cross-border research hubs, and shared frameworks for academic mobility. We must create a truly pan-African knowledge ecosystem that centers African agency. This evening's lecture, titled The Three Deaths of Steve Biko, Towards a Jurisprudence of the Irreparable, asks us to reflect deeply on memory, power, and responsibility. And in that spirit, I invite us all to consider the role of the university not only as a space of imagination, but also as a site of mobilization for the action that we need for this continent. As Professor Modiri so powerfully reminds us, justice delayed is not only justice denied, it is justice disfigured. Let us be institutions that refuse to look away in terms of the issues that face this particular continent, the challenges that face this continent, but importantly on the role that we will play to addressing those issues and those challenges that this continent faces. So to our guests, thank you for joining us tonight. May this lecture challenge and inspire and also provoke and ignite. May it remind us that the university is not a monument to knowledge, but a movement for change. And may we leave here not only with ideas, but with the courage to take bold steps towards the future we know that is possible for Africa. So with these few words, it's my great privilege once again to have you join us for this lecture. And thank you very much to Prof Pumla and the team for all of the organization. And thank you very much once again, Prof Modiri, for sharing with us this evening your thoughts on this very important topic and on the three deaths of Steve Biko towards the jurisprudence of the irreparable. Thank you very much, everyone.
Good evening, everyone. I am here to introduce the guest speaker for the evening. We are thrilled to have Prof Modiri to deliver the 7th Stellenbosch University Africa Day lecture. 7, some say it stands for perfection, and we have been told that it's a beginning of a new cycle. Hopefully, it's gonna be perfect. Prof Joel Modiri is an associate professor and head of department of jurisprudence at the University of Pretoria, where he also serves as acting Deputy Dean Academic in the Faculty of Law. He graduated cum laude from the University of Pretoria with an LLB. His doctoral research explored the jurisprudence of Steve Biko, focusing on race, law, and power in post-apartheid South Africa. Given that thesis, he was the best fit for this evening. He's an academic, and his teaching experience is very interesting. He has been vacillating between two faculties, which is very unique, vacillating between the Faculty of Humanities and the Faculty of Law. Not only that, of course, he obtained his doctoral degree at the age of 26. He teaches mainly in the field of jurisprudence and legal philosophy, and has taught a number of subjects, including social justice, human rights, law, and transformation. He has taught several courses in philosophy, political science, and sociology. Prof Modiri is a renowned scholar. His research interest includes critical race theory in South Africa, and he has introduced race theory into South African legal curricula. That is very fascinating. While other progressive countries are actually interrogating the critical race theory, he's brave enough to introduce that in South Africa. And he is known for his interdisciplinary teaching across law, philosophy, and political theory. He has published extensively and has peer-reviewed several journals and edited volumes with over 15 academic articles to his name. He has recently published a book. His scholarship has been cited widely, reflecting his growing influence in the fields of jurisprudence and legal philosophy. Allow me to talk about his recognition. In recognition of his academic excellence and social impact, Prof Modiri was named one of the Mail and Guardian's 200 young South Africans in 2018. That is the year in which he graduated as a doctor. He is an inaugural fellow of the Atlantic Fellowship for Racial Equity, which is a global initiative housed at Columbia University and the Nelson Mandela Foundation. Recently, Prof Modiri was appointed as a United Nations Independent Eminent Expert in the area of race and racial discrimination. Folks, girls, guys, we are delighted to engage with this distinguished scholar as he continues to shape the legal discourse in South Africa and beyond. Take time, relax, and listen to this legal scholar who is committed to justice, transformation, and intellectual rigor. Join me in welcoming Prof Modiri to the stage.
Okay, good evening. Thank you, Dr. Mkhize, for that exceedingly kind introduction. We don't always get those in the university. Thank you, Professor Pumla Koboda-Madikizela, for the wild idea that I should come here in Stellenbosch to give this lecture. People often ask me in Pretoria, what are you going to do at Stellenbosch? So I'm going to drink wine. But it's also the exceptional standards of humility and hospitality at this university that keeps bringing me back here. So thank you very much, Mr. Vice-Chancellor, and congratulations. My new Vice-Chancellor is also an engineer, so good luck to us too. Yes. And let me thank all of you for coming here this evening to join us. I hope that the provocation I'm going to offer is going to be of some value in your ongoing struggle to transform as this country and this world and our institutions similarly do the same thing. I have given for these reflections the title of The Three Deaths of Steve Biko, Towards a Jurisprudence of the Irreparable. Now I want to begin with a quote by Saidiya Hartman. How might we understand mourning when the event has yet to end? When the injuries not only perdure but are inflicted anew? Can one mourn what has yet ceased happening? The problem space of tonight's talk is the ongoing question of whether we have truly reckoned or even begun to reckon in earnest with the living presence and afterlife of colonial apartheid. By this, I mean not only that we are living in the future created by colonial apartheid, its spatial and socio-economic determinations, its violent divisions and suspicions, and its unbearable psychological damages. I also mean that we are suffering from all the futures of human freedom and possibilities that it foreclosed, as the ferocity of Euro-Atlantic colonial modernity ruptured and disorganized the very fabric of time, of history, of reality. Stretching nearly 6 centuries and leaving no corner of the world untouched, the violence that made this world and that now orders the structures and knowledges by which we live remains, from our view, a most terrible and unimaginable evil. Yet we remain intimately surrounded by it. The disasters of colonialism and capitalism, born from Europe's domination of the planet, leaving their signature on every feature of human existence and imperiling now our global survival, have left us with a broken and dying world. Despite announcements of the end of history and the triumph of human rights for all, ours remains the time of slavery, the time of conquest, the time of empire, and it must be said, the time of genocide. Even in sunny South Africa, once deemed the rainbow people of God, and despite the promises of political freedom and constitutionalism, one is overwhelmed by the specter of the past, by the sense of a chapter that is not yet really closed, an injustice not yet resolved, and a wound not fully healed. If we recall the view that settler colonial white supremacy is a structure and not merely an event, in Patrick Wool's famous formulation, then there appears to be no way of getting around the fact that the liberation struggle, which we today call the transformation struggle, is still open, still in motion. To a South African audience trained as we are in the sentimental education of Madiba magic and raised on the idea of a miracle nation with the best constitution in the world, and these quotation marks are important, this sounds like a grim and depressing picture. I like depressing scholarship. What about all the heroes and heroines, all the valiant struggles, all the labors, all the prayers that toppled apartheid, that ended legalized racism and segregation, and introduced the idea of a South Africa that belongs to all who live in it? A limited and incomplete emancipation, after all, is still an emancipation, one might declare. It's going to be a key provocation of my lecture to trouble this premature desire for flowery and optimistic visions of South African history. It's going to be my hope to undo this yearning for narratives of redemption and overcoming, and it's going to attempt to disturb our inclination towards closure and happy endings simply because they do not seem to be any. But I do this in part to amplify the silences, the ghosts, the remains that trail and haunt the new South Africa. I do this in part to invoke what legal philosopher Jaco Barnard Nodier calls the specter of reparation and the irreparable, by which he means to say that post-apartheid South Africa suffers from a pronounced continuation of the broken social order inherited from apartheid. There is, Barnard Nodier tells us, just too much injustice involved in the everyday existence of the majority of our people after apartheid for there to be any sense in which the divisions of the past can be said to be healed. The irreparable has not been repaired, cannot be repaired. South Africa, Jaco Barnard continues, thus remains irreparably broken, irremediably unjust. Another theorist of the irreparable in the scene of New World slavery, David Scott, isolates the key features of an irreparable evil. First, the egregiousness of its injury, the sheer scale of its offense to the human personality. Second, its extended and unmitigated duration in the form of a multi-century and intergenerational institution of oppression. And third, a shameful neglect of the demand for justice and repair that transforms this evil into a permanent, immovable wrong. Colonial apartheid arrived on our shores in 1652 by way of 1492 and etched itself onto the structure of social relations, political economy, statecraft, and subject formation. As Scott highlights, the irreparable quality of such evils as slavery and colonial apartheid lies not only in their catastrophic and tragic nature, but also in what he calls their incalculability and their irreversibility. Irreparable evils cannot be reduced to a list of bad things that can be calculated and compensated, nor can they be undone or redone. Because unthinkable, irreparable evils are similarly resistant to accounting and articulating what any repair or just resolution may seem like. Scott refers to this as the paradox of the irreparable. That is, that the moral and historical wrongs of slavery and colonization and apartheid, even while irreparable, demand a powerful and radical moral and reparatory response. Unrepaired histories therefore continuously call out for repair and for justice and cannot be addressed politely. There is, in the pantheon of African philosophy and black political thought, no greater theoretician of the irreparable than Stephen Bantu Biko, the great prophet intellectual of the black consciousness movement, under whose pen gathered together the global revolutionary aspirations of the black world and the third world. The life, memory, and name of Biko operates as a master signifier for a wide variety of associations, like Ghetto Fabulous and T-shirts. Most powerfully, though, he evokes the figure of a heroic, authentic, and combative black selfhood. The force, the prescience, and the resonance of his writings in his time and ours is captured in the clarity and seriousness of both his pen name, Frank Talk, and the title of his essay collections, I Write What I Like. These have earned him a place amongst the most venerated ancestors of the black freedom struggle. Because black consciousness endures, however, as more than memory, as more than past conviction. As the society that he subjected to scathing criticism for its racism and Eurocentrism, its devaluation of black life and its unethical value systems appears more and more coterminous with the one we live in now, the figure of Biko becomes a haunting presence, a living and urgent voice, a reminder of precisely the incalculable and irreparable enormity of the historical injustice. The activist intellectuals Ahmed Verava and Prishani Naidu speak of Biko in exactly these terms. They write that Biko belongs to a different order of time, heterogeneous and dense, where the dead still live with us. The past and present are reconfigured in the instantaneous time of the here and now. This Biko is the ghostly presence that haunts the transition and threatens always to rise up in the rebellions of the everyday and the force of ordinary people as they claim their dignity against the violence of history and power. If Biko lived for black freedom, he also died for it. And if he continues to live on, he appears to die again and again at the hands of a society that will not heed his haunting. We turn briefly to 3 chapters in the lives and deaths of Steve Biko and the idea of black consciousness as we think about the irreparable in our time today. The first bit is 1946 to 1977. I'll call this bit Biko and the life-giving force of black consciousness. Although an ordinary day by any standard calendar, 18 December 1946 in Ginsberg Township in the Eastern Cape bears the special markings of the birth of Stephen Bantu Biko, which would set in motion a world historical intervention on these South African shores. Educated in missionary and Catholic schools and concretely alive to the violence of the apartheid state, having himself been arrested as a teenager together with his older brother, the young Biko began to form a strong oppositional consciousness, which would come to fruition in his 20s amidst major upheavals in 1960 South Africa. The bannings, in particular, of both the ANC and the Pan-Africanist Congress in the wake of Sharpeville left a political vacuum in black politics that galvanized Biko's intellectual and political formation. For Biko, the challenge was for black people to overcome the degeneration and demobilization imposed by white racism and state repression, and to attain what he called a radical political consciousness, an agency and a self-determination necessary to overcome the evils of his time. It was his experiences as a medical student at what was then called the non-European section of the University of Natal that would further shape his critique of liberal non-racialism. It would shape his denunciation of white liberalism, and it would also deliver his insights into the social and psychological harm of racism. After being elected as a student representative council member of Black medical students, Biko attended a NUSAS Congress, National Union of South African Students, that was hosted at that time at Rhodes University. When the university, under the pressure of the apartheid state, decided on maintaining segregated accommodation and eating facilities, Biko railed strongly against this. He challenged the NUSAS leadership and members at the Congress to rebuke the segregation imposed by the university. The refusal of the NUSAS executive at that time to adjourn the Congress until a non-racial mixed venue was found was telling for Biko. He is quoted by Donald Woods as saying that, "I realized for a long time that I was holding onto the whole dogma of non-racism almost like a religion, feeling that it was sacrilegious to question. I began feeling that there was a lot lacking in the proponents of the non-racist idea, that as much as they were adhering to this impressive idea, they were in fact subject to their own experience back home. They had this problem," Biko says, "of superiority, and they tended to take us for granted and wanted us to accept things that were second class." Biko grew deeply disenchanted with the white liberal position on race and with the inferiorizing climate engendered by socially and institutionally white spaces. He was unequivocal in the conviction that the form of white vanguardism he had experienced in NUSAS reinforced white supremacy, insofar as it affirmed the myth of white cultural and epistemic superiority. It was necessary for Biko then at this time for black people to break away from this white vanguardism and take full ownership of their struggle to reclaim their humanity. Indeed, it had become apparent to Biko that white liberals, viewed as both progressive and even radical, were working in the same epistemic, discursive, and perceptual field, anti-blackness, as white conservatives, who were exclusively marked as racial supremacists. He was the first, therefore, to collapse this distinction between white liberals and white conservatives. It was to be expected, Biko argued, that white liberals, much like all other whites in South Africa at this time, would be, to quote him, inextricably mired in the unquestioned assumptions of their own racial and imperialist experience, and that their sympathy with the black anti-apartheid struggle would be based on their white experience of how indigenous people felt and thought and dreamed. Biko's rupture with the politics of white liberalism can be taken to be the decisive moment of germination of the idea and theory that is black consciousness, richly influenced by a variety of thinkers and movements, including Malcolm X, Black Power, the Pan-Africanist Congress, Anton Lembede, Robert Sobukwe, Black Theology, Frantz Fanon, Paulo Freire, Ujamaa, Kenneth Kaunda, Kwame Nkrumah, and more. Mabogo Mure defines it, black consciousness is the black person's coming to consciousness of herself as black. It entails, in James Cone's words, the black community focusing on its blackness in order that black people may know not only why they are oppressed, but also what they must do with that oppression. Black consciousness thus contains an analytic, why they are oppressed, and programmatic, what they must do, dimension, and aims first to understand conceptually and theoretically the workings of racial oppression and the modes of its operation, and from that basis, develop a liberatory praxis to struggle against and overthrow that oppression. In Biko's own words, black consciousness is in essence the realization by the black person of the need to rally together with his brothers around the cause of their oppression, blackness of their skin, and to operate as a group in order to rid themselves of the shackles that bind them to perpetual servitude. It seeks to demonstrate, Biko continues, the lie that black is an aberration from the normal, which is white. It is a manifestation of a new realization that by seeking to run away from themselves and emulate the white man, blacks are insulting the intelligence of whoever made them. It seeks to infuse in black people and the black community a newfound pride in themselves, their efforts, their value systems, their culture, their religion, and their outlook to life. A number of important philosophical themes emerge from this passage, and they include the centrality of oppressed group perspectives as the basis for critique and liberation, the challenge to white normativity as part of a broader effort at debunking the violent myth of white supremacy, claiming political agency through self-reliance, and reasserting an African epistemology. For a liberation struggle to be possible, according to Biko, the oppressed must have the right mental attitude. They must see themselves as people who can claim freedom and revolt against injustice, which can only come, as he said, from a mature political awareness of one's reality and one's situation. In this regard, Biko's emphasis on consciousness, on the psychosocial dimensions of apartheid, his call for what he called a political as well as mental insurrection was a crucial theoretical intervention that led to his rejection of the category of non-white. I know here at Stellenbosch, you use people of color. I always cringe. But anyway. This led to both his rejection of non-racial, of non-white, and his rejection of tribalism in favor of a broad political conception of blackness. In this way, race was defined away from biological and cultural facticity, and it became for him a cultural of political and historical social relationships. Race, for Biko, is a term of power and resistance. It speaks no other truth but the truth that has been historically entrenched. By 1970, black consciousness had not only developed philosophically by Biko and his comrades, but also institutionally through organizations such as SASO and the SASO, South African Students Organization, and the SASO newsletter, in which Biko published his now famous columns. He didn't use ChatGPT to do so. While working as an activist, intellectual, and a political organizer, Biko also deeply valued a life of the mind. And he cultivated black consciousness into a way of life, as his comrades say, predicated on a revolutionary but also reparatory relationship to the human condition. As the influence of the black consciousness movement grew, especially through the formation of the Black People's Convention, through the establishment of the Black Community Projects, and the circulation of the Black Review periodical, so too did the apartheid state's crackdown on black consciousness movement activities intensify. The periods of 1973 and 1974 placed Biko, now a married father, at the center of the major BPC SASO trial, which famously placed not only the leaders of the movement, but the very ideology of black consciousness itself on trial. In the imagination of apartheid law, black consciousness as a movement for liberation and critique of the white power structure itself constituted an act of terrorism. The very idea that black people should be free was regarded as terrorism. The very thought, the very idea, the very desire for liberation was marked as terrorist in the apartheid archive. Indeed, a month after Biko concluded his testimony in this trial, the Soweto revolts of 1976, which were undoubtedly influenced by the spirit of black consciousness, came to national and global attention. The events following the revolts led Biko to a re-evaluation of the political developments of that period. And he would engage in two major theoretical turns at this point. First, he would attempt a stronger integration of Marxism or class analysis within black consciousness, maintaining the primacy of race, but with an understanding of the economic forces behind white racism. And then secondly, he would expand and incorporate an anti-imperialist, third world and international outlook into the itinerary of black consciousness. A third underdeveloped shift was Biko's thinking on the viability of armed struggle against white minority rule in the context of growing political killings, detentions, and assassinations of many of his anti-colonial dissidents and comrades. Sometime in August 1977, upon returning from an abortive trip to the Western Cape, Biko was stopped at a roadblock near Grahamstown. After brief exchanges with police officers, Biko, in disguise, was arrested and moved to police headquarters in Port Elizabeth. This was the last time Biko was to be seen alive. It is only in the account of Peter Jones, who was traveling with Biko at the time, that we have a glimpse of the vicious and humiliating torture that Biko must have suffered. Much of the details of his detention and later his death were shrouded in state secrecy and in bureaucratic lies. But what we do know is that on 12 September 1977, Bantu Stephen Biko was killed and died a devastating death shortly before his 31st birthday. In the midst of national and international mourning, Biko's mother reaffirmed the prophetic quality of his name and also the inextinguishable force of his life when she said, "In truth, he was not my child. He was the son of the people." This is what I will refer to as Biko's first death, a mortal death that failed nonetheless to terminate the striving for black liberation and dignity that defines the legacy of Steve Biko. 1995, Azapo and the Forgetting of Biko. The name and memory of Biko, last seen in the legal archive in the inquest into his death, would return to the highest court of post-1994 South Africa as a reminder of what remains unfinished and unfree in the new constitutional dispensation. A reminder that prompts an endless probing of the silences and crises embedded within the new legal and political order. The crisis of the irreparable, which Biko articulated philosophically and which his own death underscored, would come to trouble the Constitutional Court in the 1996 decision of Azapo versus President of the Republic of South Africa. In the Azapo case, Biko's widow, Mam Nontsigalelo, and the Azanian People's Organization, which is a black consciousness formation formed after his passing, together with the families of other anti-apartheid activists, challenged the constitutionality of what we now call the amnesty provision in the Promotion of National Unity and Reconciliation Act, the act that gave rise to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The amnesty provision allowed the TRC's Committee on Amnesty to grant amnesty to perpetrators of gross human rights violations. Once granted, such amnesty extinguished the criminal and civil liability of the perpetrator as well as that of the state, effectively leaving the victims of these violations without legal redress. And you will all have followed that these cases are being reopened and new legal work is happening on this. The applicants, Biko's family and of the other activists, argued that the amnesty provision, together with its wide scope of exemption, constituted an unjustifiable infringement of the constitutional right of access to courts. But the larger point, the non-legal point, was a contestation that the act sought to separate the imperative of healing and reconciliation from the demand of natural and historical justice. This separation between reconciliation and justice was, for the applicants, morally and politically dubious. It was not coincidental that the challenge itself emerged from the memory of Biko, that it came from the ideological perspective of black consciousness, since these carry philosophical convictions that run counter to the terms that gave rise to the negotiated settlement in the first place. Although litigating within the terms of post-apartheid constitutionalism, the applicants were raising a much deeper crisis at the heart of the legal order, a crisis that remains with us today. Namely, that the process of transitional justice embarked upon in South Africa after the formal abolition of apartheid primarily sought to serve elite political and economic powers and firmly secured the interests of the beneficiaries and agents of colonial apartheid. The applicant's case underscored the problem that the institutional hydraulics of nation building the privileging of political stability and vested interests that was at the heart of the making of the post-1994 South African state risked foreclosing for the nation a deep reckoning with the past that could enable the transformation of subject positions in social relations. By placing compromise at the heart of social, legal, and political change, the advent of constitutional democracy would paradoxically mutate into a stubborn and frustrating changelessness, since the fundamentals, and thus the fractures of colonial apartheid, would largely be left intact. Azapo, therefore, must be read principally as concerning the violence that is foundational to the making of the new South Africa. In upholding the constitutionality of the amnesty provision, despite the powerful legal, moral, and political challenge instituted by the figure of Biko, it was the Constitutional Court, the post-apartheid state, and the myths of transitional justice that inflicted Biko's second death. From his own time and space, Biko prophetically announced his opposition to the post-apartheid project of reconciliation without justice by asserting a contending historical and social interpretation of the South African reality. Biko, in his writings, I keep reminding that this is important, the major philosophical development of Biko's writing are happening in his 20s. So we have no excuse to not be reading in class. Biko recognized that the fundamental disorder in South African society was and is that while black people numerically and statistically outnumber white people, they were subjugated by a white minority government, and that they were subject to extreme forms of social, political, economic, and cultural domination, which subsumed their lives and their experiences. In his writings, he traces this problem to 1652, which signifies that according to his understanding, South Africa is a settler colony that at least since the 17th century has been organized in terms of what he calls the totality of white power. In this situation, it is what he called the color problem, following Du Bois, and not class or even totalitarianism that is the source of the fundamental problematic in South Africa. To end the colonial order in South Africa and to actualize a liberated society, a movement of black consciousness was required to confront and dismantle white society. We should remember here that by posing the aspiration for a true humanity against the racialism of colonial apartheid, Biko points not only to the devastation wreaked on the lives of black people, but also to the brokenness in the humanity and humaneness of white people, evidenced by their historically sanctioned indifference to the racial suffering of others and their misrecognition of how their social position has been secured through centuries of violence and subjugation. Biko puts to rest the widespread caricature that demands for historical redress are forms of vengeance or retaliation. Because for him, this is important, it is to the psychological, historical, and social benefit of white people as beneficiaries of racial oppression and as descendants of European conquerors that equilibrium be restored, that the category of conqueror and conquered, settler and native be substantively abolished. The assumption or allocation of personal, collective responsibility on the part of white South Africans would, on this view, be the only thing that could reconcile them to their unredeemed history and enable for them an active and thoughtful reckoning with the racist past and present. Another way to express this is in its inverse. More than just a ruse, post-1994 South Africa, its negotiated settlement, its politics of forgiveness and empty symbolism, its absolution of white South Africans from the debt of reparation, and its maintenance of colonial apartheid economic relations is unethical or unethical insofar as it prolongs and worsens the racial conflict and the historical trauma that it allegedly seeks to end. In the result, notwithstanding the granting of amnesty and the official completion of the TRC's work, white people would continue to carry the marking of oppressor and thus remain unfree as well, though I understand they have other places to go now. In Biko's conception, a non-racial society can only come into being through abolishing the racialized markers of being, and precisely not through the protection of anyone's racial interests in the name of national unity. The choice, the hard, impossible choice that was made to found a new South Africa on the basis of compromise and negotiation, paradoxically has kept alive the antagonism that needs to be overcome. The inordinate focus during the transition to a new constitutional order on only legal and political apartheid, and not the longer colonial period characterized by dispossession and epistemicide, and the lack of attention to the spatial, cultural, economic, and psychic apartheids that crucially define the racial reality. All of this is why South Africa is now in a conceptual and political crisis. Biko placed an emphasis on substantive social reconstruction and on a paradigm shift in the governing value system, social relations, and institutions of South African society. He foresaw with prescience that black political leadership in an unchanged economic and social structure would have no effect on the hegemony of the historically dominant white racial group in South Africa. Famously, Biko predicted that if we have a mere change of face of those in governing positions, what is likely to happen is that black people will continue to be poor, and you will see a few blacks filtering through into the so-called bourgeoisie. Our society will be run almost as of yesterday. It was then and now for Biko an error to equate the inclusion of black people into already created systems, institutions, and practices with freedom or justice, because it is not. It is an even greater error to reduce liberation to the constitutional recognition of socio-economic rights and access to basic services. A process of liberal democratic constitutional change which does not at the same time bring about a restoration of the polity at the level of political economy, ways of knowing and being, and social relations can only produce an abstract rather than authentic and concrete liberation. This delivery of only an abstract and illusory freedom creates a ruse or a tension in which formerly liberated subjects still occupy the position of the underclass of a society. In such a case, the new order in Biko's prophecy marks a re-articulation of black people's unemancipated condition. This is why we are where we are today. People often wonder, what are all these white people talking about? They are living so well in South Africa. Where are they going? Well, partly because a symbolic split happened at the course of the transition. What the transition did is it gave people the symbols of freedom, but it allowed white people to keep the essence of freedom. That's true. What white people yearn for now, at least the ones traveling all over the world, is to regain both the essence and symbol of power. Power is meaningless if you can't show it, if you can't use it. And of course, Trump provides that freedom to hate and to dominate. Black people, on the other hand, have only the symbols of freedom. Black political power, black names on streets, but not the essence of freedom, rendering all of South Africa unfree. 2025, Trump in Africa, genocide, nihilism. This is the shortest part. I wrote it last week when I was depressed and thought I have to say this. This brings us to our present political moment, what I would call the third death of Steve Biko. Long in the making at the hands of neoliberal hegemony that has undermined the educational, economic, and ecological basis of democratic life, the present political scene is marked by profound disorientation. It has been called a time of fascism. It has been called a time of nihilism. Most powerfully, it has been called a time of historic loneliness, in which many political communities around the world appear to be giving up on the idea of responsibility, giving up on the idea of democracy, worldliness, and social justice, demonizing ethical questions as wokeness, attacking media and educational institutions that are engaged in truth-telling and critical scholarship, and rejecting all calls for repair, redistribution, and redress, seeking to protect vested interests and historical supremacies of nation, of race, of gender, of class, of nation, of religion, and of ethnicity. The countries, the worlds where this is happening are far too many to name. The right-wing turn in Western politics is also the right-wing turn in the global political order. Though signaled dramatically by the second Trump presidency, it also has its face in South Africa in the rise of Afrophobia in South Africa, the counting of how many so-called African foreigners work in universities, the perverse reduction of human beings to geographies they did not create. This erasure of historical facts has to be seen in the context of the tragic failure of the revolutionary ideals of Pan-Africanism and anti-imperialism, which has weakened our ability to challenge new and old forms of racial capitalism, xenophobia, global white supremacy, and most importantly, our impending ecological collapse. This would be in keeping with Biko's linking of black consciousness to the global struggle between the third world against the rich nations. It's as if he knew about the tariffs, like. What we are seeing is the hyper-globalization of colonial apartheid and the reassertion of the unlawful and lawless prerogatives of violence. Yet even in this description, we cannot account for our forced witness to the multiple crises unfolding across the planet. A rapidly overheating planet, the dead bodies of children piling up on our television screens, the attacks on black Africans as once again foreigners in the lands of their own birth, the devaluation of knowledge and education, the loss of faith in collective democratic self-rule. All of these not only mark the accumulation of the disasters of colonialism and capitalism, as humans lose more and more control over the powers that rule over their lives. This disaster, this present of historic loneliness, also dims the prospects of Biko's powerful vision, as he put it, of giving the world a more human face. If a conclusion were even possible under these conditions, it would be that the prophetic and piercing ethical imagination of Steve Biko affords us no easy way out of our present historical condition. We must work to reclaim historical possibility against the past. We must confront and name the violence. We must fashion radically different ways of living together. In a word, we must face up to the irreparable. If such an undertaking feels impossible, feels dangerous, feels demanding and unceasing, that may be because it is. It seems then an apposite way to close with this encomium from the Jamaican theorist Sylvia Wynter. She says, the only cure will be a transformation of the whole society and an entirely new knowledge order together. Otherwise, we will remain trapped in this. Thank you.
But what an ending. I really love that ending because I was waiting for something like that. Because as you yourself will clearly tell us that you were digging on this path to challenge, to provoke. But what an ending with Sylvia Wynter, and in fact to bring that into dialogue with Steve Biko's own sense of the desire to create a more human society, a more human world. And so I want to start there, in my response to begin the conversation. And I hope that you will all have questions and comments for Professor Modiri, because this is why we are here, is to really inspire these conversations. So we're looking forward to that. But I want to start with the idea of the life of the mind. I find the way that you have sketched and mapped, Steve's Biko's life of the mind as a site of knowledge production. Because what you are sharing with us is a gift of how to know anew. And so I would like you to say something a little bit more for us. If you think about these two, for want of a better way of presenting them, two visions. One is the life of a mind of a student at a university such as this one, and how we enter the space of, the openings, the epistemic openings that are created by conversations such as yours on the one hand. So the life of the mind in a space like this, and the vision of a new society which is inspired by a new humanity. How might that look like? As scholars in this space, putting at the center of it the notion of the quest for the reparative. I know that to say that, there is an impossibility. But nonetheless, we have to continuously be pursuing this quest. So if you could just paint for us, what might that look like?
Yeah, I would have, when you called me, I started getting really anxious about what I was going to say today. And the initial lecture I would have given would have carried the title, The Reparatory University. And I'm revisiting and interested in the question why the kind of right-wing fascist movements are attacking universities. And that partly has to do with the fact that that most revolutionary possibility begins in universities, through literacy and through knowledge. At the same time, the university itself is giving up on its knowledge enterprise. It's becoming a business. It's becoming a corporation. Academics themselves, the knowledge project itself is undergoing severe commercialization. So here you have someone like Steve Biko who's studying medicine in Natal and is reading from the apartheid state's banned books list. Autobiography of Malcolm X, Rachel of the Earth. I thought that was really foolish of the apartheid state to publish the books people shouldn't read because, as you can imagine, the first thing that's going to happen is people should read that. So there is no possibility, I think, of a real serious reckoning with the history of this country, with a reparatory democratic project, which will be a global one. We're thinking about alternatives to economic and social existence without critical literacy. I'd like to see more reading going on, and that's why I mentioned the ChatGPT thing, because universities are also just entertaining this thing because it's trendy and it's fancy, and I suppose some of them are getting money from Meta or Facebook. But I would like to defend the idea that in the deepest darkness of the apartheid state, people like Steve Biko were concerned with ideas, were concerned with how to make sense of the world that they were living in, that was part of ruling over themselves, that was part of governing themselves, and that was part of what a free existence means, is the ability to read. So we must, as university scholars, writers, thinkers, preserve this concept of the life of the mind, the idea that we are called to think. I know people ask you, what do you guys actually do at the university? You know, people say, where are you? I say, I'm at home. And they say, oh, but you're not working today. I say, no, I'm working. I'm
Yes, exactly.
But we must restore to the university and to the publics outside of the university the idea that reading is essential for revitalizing a free life. And it saddens me that our students hate reading.
Reading, but then creating knowledge.
That's
also, right? Yeah, and how much, this is the last time, and I'm going to, where is the timekeeper? I just want to make sure that we do not, but let me just say that, just one last point on this idea of reading and critical thinking. Where is the place of the values, you know, when we think, for instance, about how do we restore a society that is grounded in a sense of the human, the meaning of the human. I mean, I like to use the notion of the African notion of ukuba ngumntu. You know, because to say human, it's sort of like you're a human being, you're like me, you know, we share the same values. But when in the African context you say ngumntu, you know, ukuba ngumntu, how do we draw from these values as a way of restoring that critical mind, that mental consciousness of who we are? Because once we embrace that notion of what it means to be human in that deep, profound sense, then the possibility of solidarity is strengthened, isn't that so? And how do we build a sense of knowledge making around that journey of, you know, moving towards that essence of what it means to be human, in the sense of Sylvia Winter and Steve Biko himself.
Right. Oh, those are very hard questions.
I know it is, but you don't have to answer it, but think about answering it in some way in the course of the conversation.
We will.
Yeah. Okay, so now is your chance. Any first hands? There's a hand over there. There's one. So could you help me, please? Yeah, because the sun is blinding my eyes. With the mic, just go to the person with the mic. Thanks, Andile. Okay, so there you go, please. Yes.
Good evening. I just want to say thank you to you, Prof Modiri. I really appreciate this. I'm a big fan also. So I have a question. And I think I quickly want to ground it to come back to what initially really challenged me was what you said in respect to the conflict of the white people and respect to fighting and like this in can I say the conflict of being with respect to the space and like protecting that. So if I can just read from this quick abstract I have, Gertrude Spivak wrote can the Sub-Latin speak that we have a legal subject of a socialized capital, neither labor nor management, holding strong powers, but with supposedly unquestioned access to due process. So I understand that to mean that what the legal subject is, or what we are, can be considered in respect to the legal space, is conceptualized on a specific type of being. So what is it that we can do if we were really serious about repairing the damages of the past? Like, what is it that we can do that we can be on an equal playing field, if that is at all possible? Because currently we have one way of being, which is being in the conceptualization of white being.
Thank you. There's a second question over there. Please ask the question as Chris.
Hello. So I am writing part of my dissertation on the nationalist imaginations of Steve Biko's essays. And it seems to me, or at least in my experiences and from your talk today, that there is this tension between death and spectrality or afterlives. The fact that, at least from what you said today, there is this official neglect and official marginalization of Steve Biko's imaginations for future South Africa. But also at the same time, and especially for me who experienced FISMAS 4, Steve Biko was a very energizing figure, or as a very energizing symbol. And post-2015, I see a lot of appropriations of his image and politics in quasi-leftist politics. So I wonder about this tension that he is being neglected officially, but also there is this growing appropriation and also celebration of his figure, that even though he is dead, but also the specter is very real.
Thank you. You want to respond? Did it take a third one?
Thank you so much, Prof Modiri. I wanted to ask, in Steve Biko's writing, as you pointed out, he started off, or a lot of his career started off in the SRC, and I kind of want to pivot off of that. And I found a lot of his critiques on student movements to be very relevant still today. So if we're talking about this context of trying to repair the irreparable, and we're talking about the university as this ground of consciousness, what would you say, and what would you tell us as student leaders? What is your comments on student leadership as it currently stands in South Africa?
Very good questions.
At least, Professor Stevens, your students are very clever. I'll try to answer. Let me start with the one about the nationalist imagination. I often argue, not just in relation to Steve Biko, but in relation to his forebears, Sobukwe and Lembede, that the descriptor nationalist is a mistake, that they were internationalists. They had a strong vision of continental African unity. They were not bound to the South African state. For them, the South African state was an object of contestation, not of affiliation or belonging. There's a much more kind of radical critique there. But on the point that you make about the ways in which Steve Biko comes into circulation as one of the marketable figures of the post-apartheid economy, of course, he's a contested figure. It was very important for the creation of the new South Africa that he be part of the story, that he be assimilated into the story. And there have been, certainly before me, scholars who've insisted that Steve Biko's ideas cannot be reconciled with the new South Africa, that he represents an alternative imaginary that cannot sit or does not sit easily with the assumptions of the new South Africa, since he was so clear as to the question that for him, white supremacy is to be dismantled, not accommodated. I often, one of the things that I think about is the story that when Nelson Mandela comes out of prison and begins the nation-building exercise, he, of course, famously goes to meet the wives of former apartheid presidents, Betty Verwoerd and so forth. And I have been looking without success for whether he ever met the wives of Biko and Sobukwe. And I have it on good authority that he did not do so. And so in a way, I think that Biko also argues for something else. His notion of psychological liberation is the idea that even black people must be reconciled to and with each other. And I think that's a much harder demand in that regard. But Biko is contested. Some people see him as happy, clappy, sweet guy, lovely man, loves everyone, and he does. He was a Christian at heart, he really was. But he believed that it is unethical to lie about the reality in South Africa, that you cannot avoid it, that the confrontation must take place in the hope that new humans would come into being, as a result. And so you will join a whole host of people contesting and pulling and claiming, as we all do. It's like I was debating with my baby sister about my mother's favorite music. She also passed away, and we have radically different memories of what she liked. So you get what I mean. SRC, yeah, I didn't like SRC. I liked reading groups. I thought students should do. I also didn't like the student leadership model that we had adopted, which was directly linked to party politics in South Africa. I thought students could form organizations that were student-related, that were about teaching, learning, educational concerns. I'm not saying students should be apolitical as it relates to the larger questions. But it worried me that you had little ANCs, little DAs, little EFFs in campuses. I think that was corrosive. I think that continues to be intellectually problematic. I see the poor students have to read a script that they don't agree with. So I was always convinced that political parties should be banned and that students should organize politically on big questions that have nothing to do with a political party. And so the use of SRC as a pipeline to parliament and so forth, I find part of the perverseness of the new South Africa. I get why people do it. I'd like young people to be doing several things: reading, encouraging other people to read, thinking thoughtfully about the future of this society, practicing modes of citizenship that are not bound to the existing forms of rule, and doing what I think student movements have always done. 68 is also very important for Biko. It was just to challenge all power, not just the powers they don't like, all forms of power, to keep power on its feet. So I'd like to see SRCs being more intellectual. I know that's a boring answer from an academic, but I'd like to see them, I'd like to see them getting out of stuff they don't belong in and getting students to read and think and engage. I'd like to see that.
Yay.
And then there was a really hard question about the question of how you transform the concept of the human. And I'm going to say briefly that that's one of the things I hope Prof Pumla calls us back for. Very briefly, the debate on this question of the human is coming out in Black Studies is, do you abandon the category of the human as already racialized, as already racially contaminated? Or do you take Sylvia Winter's line that we have not yet known the human? Remember, the point that Biko makes is that it's not that blacks are dehumanized and whites are human. It's that all of us are dehumanized by racism. Now, if that's true, that means that means white people are not the standard of what it means to be human. So when the ANC sold to black people the idea that freedom is living in white neighborhoods, having kids who can speak good English and go to white schools, they were further dehumanizing both white and black. If that's true, then Sylvia Winter is saying it's not about. We actually need to invent a new human that did not exist. It's not like one is human and one isn't. It's actually that we've all been dehumanized by this long history. And so it seems to me the challenge is not to replace one model of the human with the other, but to imagine now what interdependent, democratic, self-ruling coexistence looks like. That is not based on oppression. That's not based on reconciliation without justice, or to use Cabral's phrase, that's not based on lies.
We have, I have something about the notion that of starting anew in terms of building a new humanism. I have, because I think that there's something in there's something in the value of beingness.
That's right.
You know, in the relationality, in the life of relationality that can offer us some insights rather than an I knew in that sense.
Yeah, it won't be from scratch because we all have neighbors, we all have friends and aunts and uncles. We know what human existence looks like. We
But to
know.
articulate and to build that as
That's right. And to
kind
pose
of
it
a
against the
knowledge.
present
Right.
narrow visions.
Okay, there is, we're going to take this side and that side. Caesar is, can you speak to the mic, people? Caesar, please.
Yeah, I was once on the SOC a few years ago. And I was at the NUSAS conference after the one that you referred to, Joel, which was in Durban. And in the evening, we went to Phoenix Settlement to a gathering where Steve Biko, together with the SASA leadership, was. And this was the most commanding presence I've ever encountered in my life, and it had a big impact on me as well, my political trajectory. But if I sort of ask myself the question, what would surprise Steve Biko the most about the political discourse today is a very simple thing. What do you mean by black? Because we have a discourse today where black is understood to mean a section of the black population in this country. And it continues to irritate me that this goes unquestioned, even in our legislation. And that's was not the term black that Biko taught, and which I think still should apply, and is why I think he was not a nationalist either. And I'd like your comment on that.
Thank you. Where did you point? Which one? Yes. Yes, please.
Good evening, everyone. Firstly, thank you so much for coming, Prof. Sorry. I'm a law student, and yeah, my name's Ogoshe. Yeah, firstly, I just want to thank you. And you know, I remember you came to our jurisprudence class last year, and you spoke about constitutionalism. Love that. Anyway, my question is, let me just read it. Sorry. Okay, so my question is, what is your answer to a person, so whether they're a student or not, who would argue that, you know, reading or education doesn't put food on the table? Because this is a narrative that's really common, and you know, and it's a difficult question, but it is an important question that we have to answer. So I'm wondering, like, how do we, on a practical level, revive the spirit of intellectualism, and most importantly, how do we bring that home, especially to people that are not within universities as well? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. There's two questions that side. Could you please just get the mics?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for the wonderful talk. My question, I think, in many ways relates to the question before me, but perhaps the challenge is quite pragmatic. And I ask, how can we begin to unearth the humane in all of us when one considers that South Africa, as it stands, is a space of apartheid spatial continuity? There was a question by the person who asked the question before me about how do we take certain knowledges and ways of thinking into spaces where people don't have access to university. And in some ways, part of the reason why that's not possible is precisely because apartheid spatial continuity persists, which prevents access to certain resources and so on and so forth. So that's the first part of my question. Sorry for asking two questions. The second question is perhaps a little bit more philosophical, if not ideological. I subscribe to the writing of Jacques Derrida on forgiveness. And Jacques Derrida is a French philosopher, for people who may not know, of Algerian descent. And he made a very interesting contention in relation to amnesty in his country that required forgetting. And he was actually quite explicit. He said that any amnesty that requires forgetting is violence in the name of reducing violence. And I want to get your ideas on that.
Thank you. We'll take one last question. This one is the last one. Because
hello.
of time.
My name
Yes.
is Siwa Balwe, and I'm also a law student. So my question is regarding this, because we're talking about towards the irreparable. So we're talking about this new identity that Black people have not found because everything has been through the lens of this colonialism. So I wanted to ask, how do we then reconcile the Black community at large? How do we reconcile the Black bourgeoisie that Steve Biko spoke about, which is also a problem in now developing this new identity, because we also have this fractured community, this fractured Black community. There's a lot of division within the Black community, as well as the people who have been previously also oppressed and have been victims of imperialism. So how do we reconcile? How do we get that unity? How do we break that system then?
Sure, thank you.
Answer what you like.
Yeah. I like all of them, but time doesn't allow us. Let me start by saying that my reading of Biko's conception of Blackness is as follows, that Blackness is a unity but not a totality. What that means is that, and by the way, the different branches, first of the PAC and then of the Black Consciousness Movement, debated this question. You'll remember that for Sobukwe, the category revolved around Africans. That included for him, what the categories we'd call now African and colored, it would excluded Indians. And why? It's because he was thinking about the category of title to territory, right? Biko collapses that further by thinking about this category of Blackness in which he includes all who have been excluded by the apartheid. That doesn't mean that the problem of Blackness in KZN and Durban was not a problem even in his time. It was not resolved by the time he died. The problem of Blackness in the Western Cape, by the way, you all know the story of his death was he was going to meet Neville Alexander. And Neville Alexander refused to meet him. I know now the story has changed, but refused to meet him. One of the things Biko was going to discuss was this question of Black consciousness, the colored question, and class analysis, and trying to expand the meaning of it. So it's a terrible chapter in history, and I think someone with more talent than I should write about it. So there's a dimension of Blackness as a unity that is aspirational. I think it's mistaken to simply impose a Bikoist version in places where this is unresolved. 3 years ago, we were working on the question of the Phoenix massacre, right? That is Blackness ripped open, ripped apart. That's not even mentioning the class, gender, and other divides. So the category is a unity that is a host to tensions that we cannot ignore or paper over. The one that's most troubling, the one I think Biko would reject the most, the two ones, he would reject the ethnic division and he would reject the nationalist division, the Zimbabwe, Malawi, Kenya, South Africa. I think there he would have severe problems. But outside of Biko, this was debated, the question of Indian anti-Blackness and colored anti-Blackness. Right? It wasn't resolved. And so I think Biko held this idea that Blackness could be a home for people, but only if they came to consciousness, not to take it for granted. And therefore, I think the debates must happen. One of the reasons I always tell people I wouldn't work in Cape Town is because it would just be hard to do this work. Because every time I say Black, I'd have to say, but I mean, or not that. It's much easier to do. So yes. I think people must be comfortable to talk about these conflicting heritages. I speak a lot to my colleagues who identify as colored, and some of them say they see that as a way of respecting their distance to Blackness. It's a way of naming their relative privilege, they say. Of course, I disagree, but the point is there's a much more contested field of identification going on there, and I think class and gender and so forth is also part of this category that is divided. But it's an aspiration, it's a home, it's a category for those who want to be free in a way. Let me say something about the question. Yes, but this one I have to answer. It's the one about literacy. First of all, let me just say Derrida's problem is he confused non-violence and anti-violence. Amnesty was violence that suspended a violence that came afterwards. It didn't cease violence, it redirected violence. And so the question is still that this question of forgiveness must come with something else. The African, the African concept here is ikala aliboli, that the matter must still be resolved, no matter how wonderfully fancy Derrida puts it. But I agree that Derrida wants us to face up to the necessity of giving things up for a future. What he misses and what many people miss is, it seems 30 years later, white people didn't give much up. I think that's the problem of reconciliation. We must all give up together, all of us, and all regain together. Anyway, the last one, reading or education doesn't put food on the table. Yes, this is important, and we have to break this thing. People often say to me, sometimes it's my students, I read your work, I didn't understand a thing you wrote. And you should write more in such a way that grandmother would understand. And I say, well, my grandmother has passed on. I think she's resting well in peace. What we do here in the academy is not, we are not journalists. We are not reporters. We try to understand the complexity of the human condition. For that, we need language. We need to stretch language. I'm not a defender of complexity or hard English, as we call it, for its own sake. But sometimes I need certain words, certain big, long, deep historical words to say the thing that I'm saying. Sometimes I need the word ontology. I need it. I've got to do work with this work of ontology. I want and I'm talking to black students here. I want you to honor the fact that your parents have suffered immensely for you to be here. And that you arrive here and then you hate reading makes me wonder what freedom means. I know harrowing stories. My other hat, I'm also an administrator who runs admissions in my faculty. And the stories that I hear from parents about what they have done, the jobs they've taken, the work they're doing, the loans they've taken to bring their kids to varsity. And the first radical thing that their kids think is that reading is bourgeoisie, or I thought to myself, I don't know what's going on here. And so I insist that the university is the most radical place in a society because it's a place where we do nothing but think. We must defend the right of the university to be a public place of thinking. In a black majority society, the people who need to be doing lots and lots of that work are black students. So that's what I think.
My colleague, I think there's music to the ears of my colleague, Steve. Thank you so much, really. We will invite my colleague, Dr. Nell Darius, to give closing remarks.
I think a thank you would be an immense understatement. I don't think it would be enough to encapsulate this conversation this evening, but I'm going to try. So thank you to our speaker, Professor Joel Modiri, for delivering the 7th Annual Africa Day lecture. This evening's lecture is indicative of the kind of conversations and debates we are engaged in at the Center for the Study of the Afterlife of Violence and the Reparative Quest. As an interdisciplinary center, our aim is to not only bring conceptual clarity to the concept of violence, but to take an intersectional approach to engaging with violent histories from diverse contexts through seminars, international collaborations, social dialogue, and arts practice, as we saw earlier today. We also seek to explore various reparative practices to understand what it means to repair the past. This intellectual inquiry is reflected in our postdoctoral support programs, which aims to support students' academic and professional development and draws on the supervisory expertise of an interdisciplinary pool of academics based at AVRIC and across the Faculty of the Arts and Social Sciences. Within the center, we are also committed to empowering emerging scholars. This is best reflected in our postdoctoral program, which nurtures the development of our postdoctoral researchers and their interests and their expertise. Years of dedication to this aforementioned mandate and ethic will culminate in our upcoming MPhil in Violent Histories and Repair, which will be launched at the start of the academic year in 2026. Young, aspiring scholars with an interest in topics related to violent histories, transgenerational trauma, and the process of repair should consider applying for this program. And we will definitely have Prof Modiri back to teach some of the courses. So for those interested in joining our conversations beyond the info, we host regular public events and all are welcome. So regarding our upcoming events, we have the final installment with the critical engagement with the issues of whiteness seminar for semester 1 of 2025. This lecture is titled Policing the Desire of Treacherous Blood Mixers, State Imposition of Afrikaner Puritan Masculinity on White South African Manhood During Apartheid. This lecture will be presented by Professor Susan M. Clausen, and it will take place on the 28th of May. For postgraduate students, the center will also host a colloquium on post-violent subjectivities in the Global South in September 2025. The deadline for submissions of abstracts is 8 August 2025. Our keynote for the colloquium is Professor Pumla Deneyokola. So please do submit your abstracts. Last, in preparation for our conference on bearing witness, recognition, responsibility, and the burden of seeing, which will take place in 2026, we will continue to host a series of public events in the lead up to that conference. So please stay engaged and stay informed on our upcoming public events by visiting our website, and also do feel free to contact our staff. So in conclusion, on behalf of the Center of the Study of the Afterlife of Violence and the Reparative Quest, and our partners who collaborated with us in preparation for this event, we would like to extend our most sincere gratitude, particularly to Professor Joel Modiri for delivering this lecture this evening. Having you is always an intellectually stimulating encounter that evokes deep thought, and it is always a call to think deeper, to think slower, and to constantly read. I think that was the message from this evening. So to the DVC for Research, Innovation, and Postgraduate Studies, Professor Moyo, and the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, Professor Basti Ruit, thank you for your continued support of the work of the Center. Also, thank you to the Rector, our new Rector and Vice-Chancellor, Professor Jaresh Ramjugunath, for continuing this Africa Day tradition. I would also like to acknowledge and thank the Rectorate and Deans present here this evening, to Mr. Bongani Mjima, Director of the SU Museum, Mr. Johannes Adams, Mr. Lloyd Africa, and Mr. Evandre Gelant. Thank you not only for your service this evening, but also your continued partnership and support of the work of the Center. To Dr. Nico Ilema and the Center for Collaboration in Africa, thank you for partnering with us on this event. Also, thank you to Dr. Zetu Mkize and Ms. Shante Neft and the Center for Advancement of Social Impact Transformation for your partnership this evening as well. And then last, to everyone present here, my heart is so warmed by the amount of students that are in the room. I think that is incredibly moving and also motivating to think that this is the future of the Academy. So to all of you present, thank you for your time, your engaging questions, and also for sitting here so attentively. Please do join us for some light refreshments afterwards, and we can continue the conversation. Thank you, everyone.